My name is Lindsey Manshack. I'm a speaker for the Missouri Humanities Council Speakers Bureau. This is my first time and the first event for the Native American Heritage program, so I'm excited to be here to talk to you all today and to kick off this amazing program. Like Melody said, this is the first of its kind for a humanities council, a state humanities council. So we're lucky to have Melody here as our leader in this program. So I'm gonna share my screen. Melody, if you could just tell me, I know my notes will pop up, but just let me know whenever you can see just my slides.
Yes, I can see your slides.
Okay.
Actually, I can see your notes too.
Okay. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge the land that I am currently speaking from here. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and I want to acknowledge the ground beneath my feet is the ancestral traditional land of the Illini Confederacy, the Meskwaki people, the Osage people, and all other Native Indigenous people who have been through the land that we're on and who are currently here today. So we thank them for being stewards of the land. We're going to start with a poll question to get a feel for what do you think in terms of history that's taught in the United States in our history level lessons. How many of you remember learning about Native history in your history classes? So if Melody, I think you have the power to go ahead and start the poll. If you're able to answer it, we have a question here. What % of state history standards do not mention Native American history after 1900? So we have 87%, 66%, 45%, 24%. And I'm not gonna, host and panelists can't vote. Okay, I'm not gonna vote. So once we have a few answers, Melody, feel free to go ahead and share those results. I'm going to move on to the next slide and let everyone know that only 87%, sorry, up to 87% of history standards don't mention American Indian people or their history past 1900. So we had 85% of you say 87%. So it seems like everyone here has a good understanding that history for American Indians is very much colonial period, colonization, and that's pretty much where it stops. But we're missing a whole bunch more history, and that's where I'm going to be talking about here today. So if you look at this 500-year timeline, for example, we have the colonial period from 1492 to 1828. Then we have reservation period. So we have the Trail of Tears, the treaty period. And those are the things, if you do, and if you are lucky enough to even hear about those things in your history lessons, you can see here, we're missing a whole bunch more history. So we have the allotment assimilation period, including boarding schools for American Indians, which boarding schools are still very relevant to what American Indians face today. Because many American Indians' parents and grandparents went to boarding school, so it's still in their immediate history. We had the Indian reorganization period, the termination period, where a lot of Native nations lost their land, but also lost their status of being a state or federally recognized tribe. And we have self-determination period up to present day, what's happening. And so all of those things are very important to have in history lessons, but unfortunately, we don't have those yet, but programs such as Native American Heritage Program is a great place to start with getting people to understand that we really need to learn that history so that we can understand the cultural practices, the landscape of what's happening today. So this is a study by Illuminative, and there was a presentation I recently went to by Crystal Echohawk, and she gave this data. Although only 87%, not only 87%, 87% doesn't meet that past 1900, 72% of Americans who were surveyed really support a change in curriculum to ensure accurate Native history is taught in schools. One of the main reasons why it's so important for American Indian history after 1900 to be taught in schools is because they also asked representatives in Congress, do you think this invisibility past 1900 affects the policies that are in place today when you're going through different funding mechanisms or proposals? And they agreed that because that there is this invisibility past 1900, it's affecting whether they even understand that American Indians are still here today. And one of the major takeaways I got was this quote by Dr. Stephanie Freiberg: "Invisibility is the modern form of racism against Native Americans." So we're still here, but we're not being seen as often or really in any capacity. If we are being seen, it is in stereotypes. So on Hollywood, it's a Native American person in regalia who maybe has a feather or who has braids, who is not necessarily what we look like today at all. And so that drives a stereotype when you do see a Native person that they have to look a certain way. So Illuminative and Indian Country Today has put forward a new mission to highlight American Indian culture and amplify the authenticity of what's currently happening today. So my mission is to highlight American Indian culture in Missouri so that policymakers, change agents, and community members really have a better understanding of who is in their community, American Indians, and what their culture looks like today. So the new narrative is that Native Americans live, thrive, lead lives across the United States, and they contribute to every aspect of the United States. We're anchored in values, and we have a living, evolving story of resistance, resilience, and economic strength and cultural revitalization. So today I will be using some terms, American Indian terms, interchangeably, possibly throughout my presentation. So I may say Native American, I might say American Indian, I might just say Native. So these are just a list of words. If you hear these phrases, it's just natural to me to use them interchangeably because I work with so many different tribal people from all sorts of different nations that each one of them may prefer and talk to themselves prefer to identify themselves in a certain way. And so in me using these interchangeably, I hope that all people who are Native people, I'm talking about all different people who are Native people. So you can say Native, Indigenous, First Nations. Some people refer to themselves as their tribal affiliation. So I am Choctaw, I am Cherokee. And then you have others who would rather be identified with their bands or clans. So I'm tribe of Ebarb. And so in Louisiana, that's how we would identify ourselves. If you have any questions about how you identify someone, it's really best to just ask them up front how they would prefer to be identified, and they will usually happily tell you, or tell you what their thought process is and how they should be identified. That's a question I commonly get when I do presentations: is what's the appropriate term? Is it American Indian? Is it Native American? And again, like I said, I've heard so many different Native people call themselves different things and refer to themselves, identify different ways. And so it's best just to ask. So on the front end, I do want to talk a little bit about tribal recognition, what it means to be a state recognized tribe versus a federally recognized tribe. And before I go into that, it is up to the tribal enrollment offices on who is a Native American member of their tribe. So that's the only people it's up to. So anytime, it's not saying that the state or federal government is saying someone's Native or not. That is up to the tribe, and that's part of tribal sovereignty. What I'm referring to here is how they're recognized and get benefits or no benefits based on where they are in reference to the state and the federal government. So as of 2018, there are 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States. This is now 574 with a newly federally recognized tribe. And it takes a lot of history and cultural documentation in order to become a federally recognized tribe. I'll use my tribe as an example. We have a collaboration with our state government, which is in Louisiana, that we are considered a state recognized tribe with the state of Louisiana. We're not yet recognized as a federally recognized tribe with the United States. That is the second end of that process. We've been trying to gain federal recognition since 1978, like the year that we became state recognized, but due to land theft and erasure in Louisiana, we've been unable to obtain that recognition. And so a little bit about what it means to obtain that recognition is that you have to be identified by external sources from historical times. You have to maintain continuous community. And a lot of times that means from the land that you're on. And as we know, it's sometimes hard to prove that you've been on that land for however long. I've heard horror stories from my family that they did buy their land, but then, they had members of the state come to their house and ask for that land, and they burned it, the paper, right in front of them. And those are horror stories that, we have to live with a lot. For my tribe especially, is that we had it and it was burned and it was destroyed, so we couldn't use it anymore. But we have to submit copies of different membership criteria, and we have to maintain our enrollment records, all of those things. So that being said, this outline today is going to be short and sweet because we have a lot to go through, but I do want to give time for Melody to talk more about the program and the resources that we have here in Missouri. So these four boys are actually my uncles. So we have my dad, my uncle Steve, and Robert and James here. So it's just a cute picture I threw in there. But they grew up in Louisiana, very near our ancestral lands, and they grew up hunting and fishing. And so I hear stories from them a lot about what it was like to grow up on our ancestral land. So I'm going to go a little bit into that. My tribe was recognized by the state of Louisiana in 1978. We're the second largest state tribe in the state of Louisiana. During Spanish and French settlement, we were moved back and forth a little bit, but luckily we had the swamps in Louisiana that were not seen as prime real estate for the settlers. And so we sort of moved there, and that's where we lived for hundreds of years. And the swamps really protected us, and we could maintain our cultural practices that way. If you can see in this picture, that's my great-grandma Maybelle Manshack and my great-grandpa. And on the bottom left is my grandpa Manshack, and my dad and my brother and me. So our tribe is here just on the border of Louisiana and Texas. So pre-colonization, or before 1492, American Indian nations were spread out throughout Turtle Island is what it was referred to as, but now the United States. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different little clans and communities throughout the land. And this doesn't even include land in Canada or South America or Central America. So there were so many people here prior to European colonization. That to be said is that they were a thriving community who had very great indigenous knowledge, and they were very smart in their architecture, in their agriculture, in their land upkeep. For one example is the Three Sisters, and that is the way that they would plant corn, squash, and beans to be most efficient to feed very large communities. And so it would be able to grow your communities because you had a very efficient way of growing large amounts of food. And also there's many different types of squash that are around this. If you can see at the bottom is where the squash was. And the indigenous ways of knowing in this example is that the soil, the way it was planted in a way where they understood the chemistry of what it took to plant within the soil to release carbon dioxide or I don't even know. I'm not very good at chemistry. Sorry, Dr. Coach Fisher, if you're listening to this presentation. But they would plant the corn as a corn stalk, and the beans would grow up. And so they could plant a lot of different plants in one very small place. They also had really high-end irrigation system. They kept up with the land. If you refer back to journals of some of the first interactions, they say how beautiful the land was and how they couldn't believe at how high quality the system of agriculture was, for example, compared to what they were used to, which was cities and a lot of people in a very small place, and people got sick very often. That wasn't really the case here. But unfortunately, a lot of history lessons, they don't really talk as much about the indigenous ways of knowing and how wonderfully brilliant it was. So, they would burn the prairie land so that the next year it would grow back even more flourished. And just lots of things like that. There's hundreds of examples of indigenous ways of knowing. A lot of scientists and public health officials have gone back and to look at indigenous knowledge now. When it's applied to contemporary global climate change issues, they are bringing in Native experts. They're asking us questions about these different things. What is the most efficient way we can grow crops? Why didn't we look at this before? And so that's something that continues to happen. So with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a law was signed by President Andrew Jackson that really paved the way for the immigration of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral land into a foreign land in the West. This short clip you can see here, where as Indian homelands are erased, oh, it didn't go again. Reservations pop up, and reservations are in red. Here's another photo of it. You can see 1492. This is all American Indian. This is pre-colonization, 1790, 1830. So with the purchase of Louisiana Purchase, there was a huge land chunk that was taken from American Indians. And specifically for my tribe, with the Louisiana Purchase, it took away a lot of our land, but we were in something called like no man's land. There was a huge section of land that really wasn't owned by French, Spanish, US yet. And so we were able to live peacefully for that very short period of time, but it was very dangerous within that no man's land. And that's where my people thrived. And so during that time, it's hard to tie our ancestry back to that land, again, because no one owned it. Native people lived there and they were stewards of the land. So trying to write that into documentation is sometimes difficult whenever you're writing proposals to the US government. So with that, a lot of, as you know probably, because this is taught in most history lessons with the Trail of Tears, Native people were removed from their ancestral land and placed on reservations. Usually that was done through a treaty. Treaty was a way, in the beginning, good for both parties. So on the eastern side of the US now, treaties maintain that tribes stay sovereign and the US government leaves them alone, and they live peacefully. As time's gone on, those treaties have been broken, and they've been very one-sided, but originally it was the best method to maintain safety for Native American tribes. A lot of times it was the only way to maintain safety for those Native tribes. This book by Susan Harjo, Nation to Nation, really highlights treaties across the United States with American Indian nations. And I wish I could play you this video. But I usually do, but since we're on this digital platform, we still haven't figured out how to do that yet. But it's based, this YouTube video is based on this book. So if you would like to look at it to get a better idea of how treaties were formed, relationships between the US government and Indian nations, I would suggest you look at that YouTube video. Let's see. As far as Missouri goes, we have a very strong treaty here that influenced what Osage people, where they went. On an autumn day in 1808, elders of the Osage Nation at Fort Clark had a council assembled to consider a treaty with the American Republic, and it would require them to give up 52 million acres of their land. Unfortunately, it wasn't a decision that they were able to really make under normal neutral standards because it was pro-offered by a threat that said sign or become enemies of the state. Of course, tribal elders wanted to protect their people, and they were swindled into agreeing to this treaty. Interactions with encroaching settlers prompted Meriwether Lewis to act, and he told them that we would wage war against you or cut them off completely or drive them from their country. And so 100 elders ended up signing this treaty here in Missouri, and they were given $1,200 cash and merchandise of similar value. As Melody had said earlier, there are other experts who can talk more clearly about Osage history. I would suggest that you watch out for those presentations. They're going to be really enlightening on what the experience was like for Osage members. They have a long history of being removed from different parts of the United States onto a new reservation. And then if you read David Grann's book, Killers of the Flower Moon, you can get an even more in-depth understanding of the huge disparity and genocide of their people. So David Grann, Flowers of the Killer Moon, go ahead and look up that book if you have time. So the Dawes Act, we're going to move on, continue moving on forward through history. The Dawes Act, 1887, was a way to take away native land that a lot of times today we don't think about. We think about it was just taken away, like through relocations. So we're like, get off this land, go to a reservation. And that was the biggest amount of land theft. But really, that's not necessarily true. A huge amount of land theft happened with federal Indian policies such as the Dawes Act or the General Allotment Act. Congress created a scheme to transfer the majority of native land that was in that reservation directly to white ownership. So native people were allowed on their reservation to buy that land in trust, but any land that wasn't bought by native people was given to white settlers or white ownership. And so that didn't happen by sword or gun, but that happened simply by pen and paper. And these tweets are from Rebecca Nagel, who is a Cherokee writer and the host of an amazing podcast called This Land. Each day in the month of November, which is Native American Heritage Month, she tweets out some really great information. So if you want to give her a follow, that would be great. But she tweeted these things that I found very interesting, that it really plunged that in itself, self-sustaining communities that were on the reservation, into despair. It was disastrous and reversed a lot of the policies. But Native Americans through that way, they ended up losing 2/3 of the remaining land that they owned, which is about 90 million acres, which, like I said, it was through pen and paper. I'm gonna go here. Fast forward through time, the Indian reorganization period was a way to transfer that land back into native ownership. But of the lost 2/3 of land, or 90 million acres, the Reorganization Act really only gave back 9 million acres, which is about 10% of what was originally owned by the native people. In between allotment period and reorganization period was the boarding school era. If you've heard of boarding schools, you know how disastrous those have been for Native communities in terms of loss of culture and loss of language. healing practices, religious practices, and cultural practices. And really what these were, reformers used education as a tool to assimilate Native tribes into the mainstream American way of life. So these boarding schools were a part of a plan to devised by well-intentioned religious folk, but these were an assault on Native cultural identity and outward signs of tribal life. So children were brought from their reservations directly to the schools. Oftentimes, parents weren't able to have a decision in it. And as you can see here, really, they wanted to kill the Indian and save the man, meaning that a Native American person who practiced their tribal traditions was not considered a man to the U.S. government. And they felt bad for those people, and they wanted to save them. And they wanted to, as you can see in these before and after pictures of students entering Carlisle Indian School, they have their Native regalia on, but then they have short hair, their hair was cut, they have mainstream clothes, and again, they're not able to speak their tribal languages. Another thing that this affects is their health in terms of understanding medicinal purposes of plants. They missed out on a lot of cultural teachings from their elders on how to eat healthy and what plants were healthy for, what the purpose of many plants were, medicinal plants. They lost understanding of the hunting and gathering territories that were known to them for being the best places to hunt and gather. So when they returned home, they were at a loss. And oftentimes, Native people, when they return from boarding schools, I think what I've read is that they had a very confusing time adapting back into their cultural lifestyles, because on one end they were taught, new like Catholicism, religion, but on the other end they also had their cultural traditions, and so they were sort of doing both, and they had their feet in both worlds at some time. When Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, it gave the power to put land back into trust and restore the land that was lost. Let's see if but unfortunately, that Native people weren't always, even though they did own the land, even though they may have had money because of the land that they were on was rich in oil, they were not seen as competent if they, depending on their blood quantum, if you were full-blood Osage living on your reservation in Oklahoma, where they had a lot of very rich oil, they were seen as incompetent of their own funds. And so they were given a guardian, and that guardian was in charge of all of their funds. And so the Indian Reorganization period really tried to take away a lot of those policies that were put in place to prohibit Native people from owning the land and practicing their sovereignty. So now hopefully the intent was to give that land back and restore that tribal sovereignty. Unfortunately, the efforts were very short-ended because they only gave back about 10% of the land, and that land was, sorry, I can see someone in the chat. Moving on, so once Native people were back on their land, moving up through history, 1900, now we're at 1945 to 1968, and we have the termination and relocation period. So Congress passed a resolution. Native people, they wanted to get rid of this Indian problem that they had. Through treaty rights, they were promised health care, they were promised food, and so the U.S. government actually had a problem because they were having to give these resources to Native communities, although they were promised to them. And so they thought of this brilliant idea called the Relocation Act, brilliant, they thought, And it was a policy of relocation, move Native people from their reservations into urban areas. So through these policies, the Bureau of Indian Affairs planned to move thousands of American Indian people to cities and urban areas. This is just an example of one of the ads that came out. This says, come to Denver for the chance of your lifetime. You have training, good jobs, happy homes. And there you can see education, jobs, family. And so any Native people who were living on reservations who thought that this would be a better life for them and their family may have taken up on this offer. And that's why we see a lot of Native people in cities, urban cities like Chicago and Denver, and actually even St. Louis. So St. Louis in 1956 also became an urban relocation city for Native communities. So if you look back in time, we have ancestral land. In about 1808, Native people were completely removed from their ancestral land through relocation or through the removal period. A lot of Native communities traveled through and over Missouri land now, maybe to stay, maybe not. But in 1956, it brought a lot of individual Native communities, community members, federally recognized tribal members to the city of St. Louis. I've done some research into what did it look like whenever these Native people came to St. Louis. Like what is that story? Because that's a story that needs to be highlighted. Are the Native the children and grandchildren of the people who came here for urban relocation in 1956 are still here. And this is something that we should definitely highlight and talk to these people to see what their story was, where they are now, and what resources were available here in St. Louis when they were promised these particular resources. And the research is very scarce. There's not much on it. So if you do have that information, I would suggest that you collaborate amongst yourselves and amongst, the Native American Heritage Program to try to get a better understanding of what that experience was like. Again, it was said to set the American Indian free, which they were saying, like, if you were able to become a mainstream Native person, you were free from your cultural traditions. So Missouri people experienced an influx of American Indian people around 1956. I think his name's Don White. He actually came here. 1956 was also the year that the St. Louis Arch was complete. And so Native people, when they came here, they were actually working on the arch. So we had Native American people coming from all over the country to help construct this gateway to the West because they were promised work. They also helped a lot with community development at the time. You can see down there, railroad, you had the courthouse as well. So the story here in St. Louis is that American Indian people helped build the city of St. Louis and other cities across Missouri. We have a poll question for you coming up, so we'll get that up soon. But now we're at present time. So in the 500-year timeline, we're up to 2000 to 2020. According to the 2010 census, the 2016 community survey, we have 326 federally recognized American Indian reservations, 573 tribes, or 5.2 million people who are American Indian in the United States. At the bottom there, I have the states with the highest proportion of American Indian and Alaska Native people. We have Alaska with 20%. And I had done a poll on this during my last presentation, and I asked, which state out of these three states do you think has the highest proportion of American Indian and Alaska Natives? And everyone had said Oklahoma. And I think they were pretty surprised when they saw how high the percentage of Alaska Native people are in Alaska compared to that. So let's go ahead and start the poll. And this question is, how many Native American people do you think live in Missouri today? Like I said, we had an influx of Native people, but just growing up here in Missouri since I was 7 years old, I really didn't feel like there were other Native American people here. But now, being a researcher at Washington University and working for the Booter Center for American Indian Studies, I had to look into what is the current population. So let's go ahead and share what the results of this survey are. So how many Native American people, let's see, can you see this on my screen now? I guess everyone can probably see it, but we have 27% think 120,000, 36% 80,000, 18, 15,000, and 18, 5,000. So actually, Missouri has around 80,000 American Indian individuals within this state, and that's according to the 2010 census. Illinois, on the other hand, has around 998,000. So together, we have 160,000 or so, plus or minus, American Indian people living in Missouri and Illinois. So there's a large percentage of American Indian people living here. Just within St. Louis County, City, Washington County, Franklin County, the surrounding 8 counties of St. Louis, we have over 18,000 American Indian people. And so one of the reasons why it's so important that we have this Native American Heritage Program here in Missouri is because we need a place for American Indians to come together during presentations, or, you know, whenever we're able to meet in person again, to share our story and to share our cultural practices together. Every year, the Booter Center for American Indian Studies at Washington University has a powwow. So if you haven't been to that, I would definitely suggest you check that out, because we have American Indian people who come from all over the country and all over the state seeking out that community here in Missouri. So although we have over 80,000 American Indian people, and this is just the data. I love to provide the data so that people can see it for themselves. And if they want to go and look at the US Census data on their website, this is what you'll find. But Missouri is not home to any state or federally recognized tribal nations, which is a big difference between not being home to a nation versus not being home to, we are home to over 80,000 state or federally recognized tribal members of communities. And so there's a disparity there. We have no tribal nations that are that the state recognizes or that the federal government recognizes, but we have a lot of people here. And a lot of these people are from tribes that were promised resources by the US government. One of those resources is the Indian Health Service, which is a healthcare resource for American Indians promised through those treaty rights to provide health care to federally recognized American Indians. And so here, if you live in St. Louis or anywhere in Missouri, I think the closest Indian Health Service facility is in Nebraska or Oklahoma, so depending on where you live. But not here in Missouri. You can't get that health care if you're American Indian. This also brings up issues of the Indian Health Service in general. The U.S. federal government, it is underfunded by them. It was promised to be a quality healthcare service, and it does not meet the needs of the people. If you are aware of right now that a huge disparity in COVID-19 cases amongst the Navajo Nation is a clear example of the underfunded Indian Health Service facilities, the lack of prevention. I mean, we need these funds to be able to prevent things like this. And if the funds are only doing the bare minimum to at least help people on normal standards, that's why we're experiencing such huge disparities amongst our tribal nations right now. So there are budget shortfalls. Again, American Indians in St. Louis or Missouri don't have access to those, and so they use other healthcare services. So this brings up, what does the current landscape of health look like for American Indians? I have a degree for public health that I got at Washington University, and it was a really amazing time to use the Booter Center to understand the cultural history and bring that together with public health to get something like this, which is a social determinants of health, which say where you live, where you're born, where you work will affect your health, no matter who you are. But specifically, American Indian people, other minority populations live in areas with higher rates of poverty, adverse living conditions, less quality schools, and they face discrimination and racism as they're growing up. That increases their stress levels, which increases prevalence of heart disease, heart attack, diabetes, obesity. And so this is just an example by the CDC of promoting health equity, which means that not everyone has the equal access to health. Even if you have health insurance, both people have health care. Some people are going to need more resources just based on where they live, work, are born. And so that's what we sort of do at the Booter Center, is look into that. We also do that, the Urban Indian Health Institute, the National Congress of American Indians. We advocate for getting better equity in healthcare for American Indians. So speaking of the Booter Center, the Booter Center is located within the School of Social Work at Washington University. It prepares future American Indian leaders to practice in tribal and urban settings and making significant contributions to the health, wellness, and sustained future of Indian country. We have Masters of Social Work students and Masters of Public Health students, and together those students make the most impact in Indian country. We have over 200 Native American graduates who have come from all over tribal nations. We also have a Booter Scholar program. We're a research center, and we do a lot of outreach to St. Louis City and the Missouri area. We collaborate with the St. Louis Art Museum, the History Museum, the St. Louis Zoo. We have a lot of amazing partners as well. So resources, if you want to learn more about anything I really said today, the First Nations Development Institute will give you more things about Native American policy. American Indian Science and Engineering Society will give you more like what's happening in those communities in terms of science and engineering. National Congress of American Indians is a great website to go through if you want to know what is the latest press release. If something comes out in in the news, and it has to do with American Indians, usually they'll within a day or two they'll release a press release to sort of give everyone guidance on what would be best for the Native communities within that population, along with some of the other ones. So okay, we have a census question. So I gave you data on the 2010 census regarding American Indian populations, but unfortunately that census undercounted American Indians by at least 5%, which is twice the amount of undercounts as the next racial group. And so we at the Booter Center and we have a program called the Natives Count program, and we have partners with Missouri Foundation for Health. We have so many people across the state of Missouri who are really trying to advocate for people to fill out their census. So my question is, have you completed your 2020 census form yet? It is extremely important that we have individuals fill out their census form if you're American Indian or if you're from Missouri, because Missouri needs these resources that are allocated through census data now more than ever. These resources are used for roads, hospitals, schools. It delegates how many representatives we get in Missouri. And in the 2010 census, because we didn't have enough people fill out the census, we lost a representative. Okay, so we have 80% of you guys have filled out the census. Congratulations. Thank you so much for doing that. That's amazing. 20% of you have not, but you plan to submit that soon. Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for doing that. It is very important that we are represented. So in summary, you know, the biggest takeaway is that American Indians here in Missouri are from extremely diverse communities and have their own unique histories. My family is from the Choctaw Apache tribe of Ebar, located in Louisiana. We moved to Missouri to seek out, you know, better economic opportunities, to get away from poverty and crime. And I grew up in a very beautiful small town here, but unfortunately it lacked, you know, a lot of American Indian culture. And I really care deeply about other individuals who are American Indian not to experience what I experienced, in terms of that lack of cultural identity. So important to understand the historical context, to understand the current landscape. If you live and work here in Missouri today, it is so important to know, you know, what the history of Native people that you are surrounded with today have gone through, so that you can work together. And so we want to ensure that American Indian people in Missouri are not erased from the history lessons here in Missouri. And even just from conversations, we have 80,000 American Indian people, and that's an undercount, like I said, by at least 5%. We think we have more, and that's one of the reasons why we want people to fill out the census, so we can see that. Improve that cultural diversity. So thank you so much for allowing me to talk to you today. And, you know, thank you, Melody, for putting together the Native American Heritage Program. And I'm just so happy that I was able to talk to everyone today.